and welcome to The Point. My name's Birgit Whelan, and as always, it's really lovely to be with you for the program. Well, if you have ever struggled with overeating or faced repeated failures with dieting, or if you're generally unhappy with this whole area of weight and food, then hopefully you'll be very interested in the topic that we have on the program this evening. And that topic is freedom from emotional eating. And we're going to be hearing a wonderful testimony of God's grace in the life of my guest, setting her free from 40 years of struggling with weight management, enabling her to lose 50 pounds of weight, and most importantly, bringing her into freedom in this area of eating and weight management. So it's a great pleasure to welcome to the program this evening the founder of Fit for Life Ever, Sue Prosser. Sue, welcome.
Lovely to be here again, Birgit.
It's really lovely to have you, and we've done a number of programs together over the years, and your testimony is so inspiring, so it's just such a blessing that you're able to be with us to share again this evening. And what I love to do when I hear your story is to go, is actually, I base it on your book, which we're going to be referring to a bit later, but in the book you go right back to a cold winter's morning in January 2004 when you stepped on the scales and you were very shocked, and your story begins from that point. And I just wonder, can I pick you up from there, and would you be able to share your story with us?
Yes, the shock of standing on those scales that morning was twofold. First of all, I was heavier than I'd ever been in my whole life. It wasn't massively obese. I was over 14 stone, and that was an all-time high for me. My weight had normally, over the last 30 years, been between 12, 12 and a half, 13 and a half.
Right.
And so that was a shock, but more of a shock was that I'd actively been trying to lose weight about 6 months earlier. And I'd got down to 12 and a half stone, and I'd been feeling pleased with myself. And the shock was that in a period of probably not much more than 6 weeks, I had put on a massive 20 pound. And so it shocked me. It also made me quite fearful, because where was all this heading, you know?
Absolutely. So what were the circumstances in your life at that time? Because that is quite a drastic increase in weight over a very short space of time. So are you able to kind of share some of the factors that were in your life at that time that contributed to that?
Yes, I think the fact that I put on so much weight in such a short time actually helped me, because it made me look inside myself and think, what has happened? What has really gone out of control here for all this to happen?
Yeah.
And fortunately, the last 6 months had been, I say fortunately, it had been a traumatic time of my life, but I was able to pinpoint the things that had gone wrong and how it had affected the way I ate. Right. What had happened was that my husband and myself had been missionaries most of our life.
Yeah.
And we'd stayed long term in Zimbabwe, we'd worked a lot in India, and we'd had an invitation to go and spend 5 years in Tanzania. And so it was in June 2003 that we'd gone to Tanzania expecting to have a fruitful time planting churches and overseeing them. Yeah. But it had all gone horribly wrong for reasons that aren't relevant now. But after 6 months of trying to make it work, it was clear it wasn't going to work. And so our oversight back in the UK just recommended that we came home. And we came home in late October, I think it was, 2003. But it was the situation that brought us back. We were known as men and women of faith. We were admired, I guess, for some of the steps of faith we made. We were mature, godly people. Yes. And now suddenly we'd said God had taken us to Tanzania, and we'd come home and we had nothing to show for it. Yeah. And had we heard God? You know, how had we got it so wrong? There was one church that had given about £8,000 for a vehicle for us, and we'd had to leave that behind. Yeah. And so we felt ashamed. Mm-hmm. I felt washed up, really, in my career as a missionary. Yeah. I felt people wouldn't be able to trust me again, or trust us, that we could really hear God's voice. Mm. And so there was all those emotions to deal with. And then looking forward, because we hadn't made any plans for any other work, it was, well, where do we go from here? Mm. And I think there was like an emptiness in my life, and a fear that we wouldn't be able to continue in our Christian work. And I realised that because of the hurts that surrounded are coming home, and it wasn't a nice situation at all.
Yeah.
Because of those hurts, I had comforted myself with food. Now, until that point, if you'd asked me if I was an emotional eater, I would have said, oh, definitely not. I actually had never seen that in myself.
Right.
Because, mature Christian, you've hung up your hang-ups,
Yes.
you're marching on with God, you're positive, you're victorious.
Yeah.
And yet, as I look back, weight had always been something that had been my Achilles heel, if you like, the one thing I'd not been able to overcome. But anyway, to come back to my story, I could see that there'd been all these emotions, these turbulent emotions in my mind that had caused me to look to food for comfort. And then I saw too that having come back from a country where we'd had plenty of food, but it was all very basic,
Yes.
that suddenly to go into the shops and the supermarkets and be faced with food that I hadn't eaten for quite a while, it was, oh gosh, I remember how good those were. Oh, I've got to have that again.
Yeah, and also that was heading towards Christmas as well at that time.
That made it even worse, didn't
yes.
it? Because we all know what the supermarkets are like at Christmas.
Yeah.
And so there was all those extra temptations, if you like,
Yes.
plus the seasonal excuse to binge, isn't there? So, I think I just put weight on thinking, well, everybody does at this time of year. It's just part of what people do, and I'll just enjoy it.
Yeah.
And then in the new year, we had got some work lined up for about mid-January, and we thought we'd just sort of clear the cobwebs out of the way, put the past behind us and go on a short holiday on a Mediterranean island. And we got there, and the weather was a bit dismal, and it was a rather bleak place, and the hotel was very mediocre. But it had one thing going for it as far as I was concerned, and this was like hog's heaven to me, because all the meals were buffet style, so you could just eat as much as you wanted. And I realised that back through my life, I guess it was my upbringing as much as anything, and brought up in that post-war generation where your parents have had to skimp and skate and save, where you're always looking for value for money. And I was brought up on that mentality. Well, look, if you can have 3 courses for X amount of money, why just have 1 course for almost as much? And so buffets had always been a weakness for me. I would get more satisfaction, Birgit, out of thinking that I'd got one over on the management than out of the food itself, because I got my hungry man certificate and stuff like that. It's bizarre now as I think back on the way I used to think and approach food. But I know I must have just pigged out for that entire time, to get something, might get my money's worth out of an otherwise a holiday that hadn't been that exciting.
Yeah.
So it was when I came back and I realised that my clothes weren't fitting me, and I didn't have any scales at the time. I actually went and bought some on the day after we got back. And I remember in the evening thinking, I won't weigh myself now because it's evening, right? Yeah. So I will weigh less in the morning. I'll wait till morning. And it was that morning, that cold, frosty morning I speak of, that I stood on those scales and I couldn't believe my eyes on that. So, I mean, I even moved them from the lino to the carpet to see if it made it. As seasoned dieters know only too well, those are the kind of tricks you do.
Yeah.
And it made me just think, I could see all those things that had happened, the rebound from deprivation, the emotional factors, the Christmas festivities, that mentality of just get your money's worth and eat all you want, That all those things had combined, and I put on that massive £20 in a very, very short time.
So it is just so helpful hearing your story in the way that you're able to really analyse and break down the different factors that contributed, because it just really sheds light on the complexity of this issue, and I'm sure that people who are watching can relate to some or a lot of what you've said, actually, just that we can face quite traumatic, disappointing experiences in our lives, unexpected, and it can really cause us to question where we are in quite a fundamental way, which you described coming back from this missionary trip, and also just the feeling of what next. And so there's this whole aspect of being at a loose end, which can contribute to to eating, the factor of boredom, but also you talk about the sort of season where there does tend to be sort of more overeating over the Christmas and holiday period, and as well going away. And it was just so interesting the way you highlighted the mentality or the belief that you discovered you had that kind of underpinned the way you related to buffets, that you really wanted to get your money's worth kind of thing. So it's very helpful to see all of those factors and how they contributed. And I'm just interested because you had tried diets prior to this. Was this the first time that you really began to be aware of these beliefs that were, or these experiences underpinning your eating behaviour?
Well, yes, because any diet that I attempted to do, any commercial diet, any well-known diets out there, didn't address those issues. I think they've changed a lot even over the last 10 years. But back in the time when I was doing these diets, it was all about counting calories.
Right.
And it was about performance when you stood on the scales in front of other people and you got applauded if you'd done well and you felt ashamed if you'd put weight back on.
Yeah.
And all of that. So as I came to this point, I'm just fed up of trying that. And my first thought is, God, I've got to go on a diet, and will you help me to stick to my diet? I hadn't decided what I would do at that point. But I really felt a distinct prompting from God not to go looking for a diet. That was the only direction I think I really had at that time. Don't go on another diet. And if I look back, they'd always ended in disappointments. I could lose weight on a diet. And sometimes I'd done very, very well.
Yeah.
But it's maintaining it. And even now, I'm more aware of people saying, oh, they're going on a diet or they've lost so much weight. And I don't say it out loud, but I think to myself, I wonder if they'll maintain it.
Yeah.
A handful of people do, but the vast majority don't. And then they repeat the entire proceedings the following year. They enrol again for their weight loss. They might try a different one this time and then go back to another. And it's just basically doing the same old. But the problem is that every time you put the weight on, for many of us, we put on more than we lost.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, and just before we come to the aspect of God's intervention and what God revealed to you, it is interesting to consider why diets fail, and it might be relevant to mention at this point the book which you've published called How to Stop Dieting and Start Living. The details are going to come up on the bottom of the screen, as well as your website in case people would like to follow up on this. But in that book, you dedicate a chapter to this aspect of why diets fail, and it really interested me looking at some of the statistics which were current at the time of publication, so that's going back a few years, but I still think that they're relevant. That it was a survey done by the British Dietetic Association, 4,000 people surveyed, a quarter of which said that they were constantly dieting or fighting the bulge, I think is how you described it. 40% of those women regained the weight and more, 20% of men are in that same category, and only 10% of that group were able to stick with the diet for 8 weeks or longer. So you begin to get a sense of really how futile diets ultimately seem to be. So I wonder if you could just explain, because I know that you've done research in this area as to why diets so often do fail for people. Can you just shed some light on that? Why do diets tend to fail for people?
There's a number of reasons. I mean, one of them is that whole sense of deprivation that diets tend to put on us.
Yeah.
I think there's more freedom in the diets today, to eat free foods and things like that. But you still are constantly aware of that's off limits. I mustn't have that. And that sense of deprivation just builds up. You can grit your teeth and bear it for a while.
Yeah.
But then that sense, it makes you focus on what you can't have. It's always the case, isn't it?
Yeah.
Even with children, something you say they can't have, they focus on and they want it. So if we're told that there's foods that we can't eat, guess what? Those are the foods that we want. And we focus on it. And then all it needs is just a moment of weakness, some negative emotion in our lives, some relationship that goes wrong or something goes wrong at work. And we go back to our default position of, oh, I know what'll fix this, it'll make me feel better. And we go for that very thing that we've been depriving ourselves of. And of course, we then instantly feel guilty.
Yeah. Can I ask you about that? Because I'm intrigued by what happens when a person does start overeating, and maybe there are some people that would even consider themselves binge eaters, so there's a kind of a compulsion to it. Can you explain that cycle and also the feelings of guilt, shame, or self-loathing that could come with that?
Yes, I think that the feelings of shame can be very strong, and that's why so many people binge eat in secret.
Right.
They slip downstairs in the middle of the night, or they've got their little stash of goodies that nobody else knows about.
Yes.
Because they feel that they're doing a bad thing if they eat those forbidden foods, as it were.
Yeah.
And so you keep on eyeing up the cupboard or whatever, and eventually you give into it. And then because you've given into it, there's all that, you get the momentary satisfaction and the relief, because those foods can contain, things that help the serotonin to be released, the chemical in our brain, and that makes us feel better momentarily. But once we start to think about what we've done, and especially when we're made to feel bad about what we've done, then that just highlights that sense of shame and guilt and depression. And it's like a downward spiral, because the more depressed and low and guilty and shameful you feel, the more actually you are likely to repeat that shameful, what you perceive as shameful behaviour.
Yeah, it's so well described. And I wonder at this point if you could tell us about how God was an answer for you, because on that January morning you cried out to God, and God really did answer you. And you mentioned at the beginning, the first thing he said to you was to lay down the dieting, to not turn to another diet. What was the process with God at that point? How has God brought freedom into this area of your life?
What I felt that God did at that time was help me to see my relationship with food in the whole context of my Christian life. Now, a guiding principle of most Christians, of all Christians who truly want to follow God, is that Jesus has to be Lord of their life.
Yes.
But you and I know we don't suddenly understand that in all of its aspects when we first hear the message. And so we might say, Jesus, I surrender my whole life to you. And I want you to be Lord of everything. But that everything isn't defined. And so at one time it's our relationships, and maybe we stop meeting with certain company that isn't doing us any good.
Yes.
Or it might be our money, and we learn to become good stewards of our money.
Yes.
And it seems that God just touches one aspect after another in our lives and says, now will you make me Lord of that? And at this time I felt that God said to me, have you ever made me Lord of your relationship with food? And I had to just, actually this has never crossed my mind.
Wow.
It's like we just separate our eating side of our life and say that's nothing to do with the spiritual. So, it's in a separate compartment. But God just showed me in that instance that he wanted to be Lord of my eating behaviour. He wanted me to have a spirit-controlled appetite.
That's really amazing.
And I actually found that quite liberating, because I know that whenever God's touched aspects of my life, to say, am I really Lord in that area? There's been that struggle and that ouch, and then there's been the amen. And when you've given that over to God, then there's been that tremendous sense of, well, God's in control of that now. And grace floods into your life, doesn't it?
Yes.
So we don't live by law and rules anymore. We live by grace. And so once I had, in a very purposeful way, surrendered my appetite to God and said, I want you to be Lord of my eating behaviour, then suddenly I realised that it wasn't just that I'd let go of something that I loved and perhaps wanted control of, but that actually I'd tapped into this wonderful source of grace and empowerment that I'd never had before. And so now I could, I began to ask God to show me when I was hungry and when I was satisfied, and to put the brakes on me. And so I began to eat for physiological reasons, primarily because I was hungry, rather than for all these other reasons.
Well, that's interesting, because I was going to ask, is that how you would define the spirit-controlled appetite, learning your physiological signals? So when your body is hungry and when your body is satisfied, is that how you would define spirit-controlled appetite, or could you shed light on that?
I wouldn't define it that way, although that is a good part of it, because also behind our eating behaviour are all sorts of emotional issues, like I described a little bit in my testimony. And it's no good just saying to somebody, well, don't do it. You know, you've got God in your life now. You shouldn't be depressed. You shouldn't be angry. You shouldn't have this pain. We do. We're all come to God in a damaged state.
Yeah.
And it's a journey. It's a process, isn't it? But just recognizing that God is there to deal with those emotions, whatever they are. If it's an emptiness in our life, such as boredom or loneliness, or even especially spiritual hunger, then God is able to guide us and to fill those voids in our life. He's created us for relationship with other people, you know, and it isn't God's desire that any of us should suffer loneliness. Now, there's the loneliness that's been on your own. There's a loneliness that's even in a crowd because of other hidden needs in our life.
Yes.
But the Holy Spirit, as we open ourselves up to him, will very gently just begin to take the lid off, as it were.
Yes.
And show us the roots of our negative emotions. Show us where things began to go wrong. And he's a healing God.
Yes.
God is a healer. So it's his grace that empowers us, but it's also his grace that comes into our life to heal us, so that we are then able to have that spirit-controlled appetite. Because if somebody, as very often happens, you know, somebody has suffered tremendous abuse as a child, especially sexual abuse, but not only that, but anything that's made them feel ashamed or lowered their self-esteem and that, those kind of hurts can be buried very, very deeply.
Yes. Yeah.
And in fact, eating is one way in which we bury those feelings.
Yes.
So we never have to face up to them. When we surrender our appetites to God and give him the lordship over that whole area of our lives, he is going to address those issues. But he knows just when we're ready for it. He knows who to bring into our lives to help us. And he never wants to leave us exposed and lying there bleeding.
Yeah.
Never will he do that.
It's just so encouraging to hear you speak, Sue, because it's actually very comforting what you're saying, and very hopeful that God actually wants to go to the deeper levels to reveal to us the roots, the source of our behaviour, and he's interested in actually bringing his grace, his healing, his comfort to that area so that we are able to be free, because that's his whole desire for us to enter into this freedom in Christ. And I'm just mindful that we only have a few minutes left on the program. I would love to bring up the photo which shows you before you entered into this freedom with God, so we can just see what God has done in your life from a physical point of view. So here you are. Now this was going back
11 years
11
now.
years.
Yeah.
So it really does show how transforming, not just spiritually, but obviously physically as well, this what God has done in your life. It's amazing, Sue. In the remaining minutes, it would just be interesting to hear about what has happened since, because you've entered into this freedom, and then there is the whole process of walking this freedom out, and it is a permanent freedom and weight loss, obviously, but have there been challenges? Has it been a case where you've encountered obstacles or failures, or felt fearful that you might be going back to old patterns? Have you encountered any of that?
I'm laughing because the buffet is still something I've got to be so careful about. You know, it's amazing how long I do know how to behave in a buffet now, and I will just go with one plate and determine not to go back for any seconds. So I've cracked it, but there's still that in there. Oh, you know, I'd love to eat everything in sight. So is it ever something you can just dust your hands and say it's finished with? No. But at the same time, it's not something I have to stress about. I live in a consciousness that that's a side of my life that God's in control of. And sometimes I do get a nudge. Of course I do. I fall off the wagon sometimes. You know, and I think, you know, one biscuit would have been enough. Why did I eat 2 or 3? Not very often, but it happens. So I wouldn't want anyone to think that it's all sewn up and I've made it. In that emotionally, I just feel I don't eat for emotional reasons. I don't feel anymore. I think that is, God has totally healed that. I would say one of the main changes that's come over the years is, whereas at the beginning my emphasis was on weight loss, as I think it is for most people, we want to look better.
Yes.
And just feel better about ourselves. In fact, God took me from that initial concern about my weight to actually focusing more on health. And the whole ministry of Fit for Life Forever now is not just focused on weight loss, it's about optimum health for the body of Christ. And part of that is just recognising that we don't own our bodies. You know, everything belongs to God, and we are stewards. We're told in 1 Corinthians 6, 19 and 20 there, that we're to glorify God in our bodies, which belong to Him, aren't we?
Sue, it has been so encouraging hearing your testimony, and I know the viewers will be able to follow up with you with the website details that have appeared on the screen. It's been such a message of hope. Thank you so much for sharing. We hope that the program has been a blessing to you. We look forward to being back with you next week, and in the meantime, may God bless you. Bye-bye.